Let me ask you guys something. What is your god roll Riven? And for some of you, would that god roll still be a god roll after watching this video? Let's find out. What's good, folks? It's KnightmareFrame here with a new Warframe video talking about Riven God Rolls and how to look for these god rolls and implement them onto your build. First things first, this video is not about farming Rivens or anything like that. It's just about getting the perfect roll for you. For those who don't know what Rivens are, it's these purple mods here. Now, Rivens are literally just mods, and any stat on the Riven mod is going to be additive to the mods on your build. The benefit of Riven mods is that they have great positives that will enhance the build. Now, because Rivens are unique mods that add bonus stats to your build, the first thing that you want to do is finish your build before implementing a Riven, because a Riven is there to add and replace at the same time. So think of it like this. You just order this amazing shawarma. Now you want a little extra flavor, a little kick. So that's when you add your shatta to get that, spicy taste, but also give it some extra flavor. For example, Rivens are mods, and these mods, of course, are placed on your weapon, and they have to match the weapon type. So this can go on any form of VIDS there is, regular VIDS or VIDS Prime. Here's one thing. When picking a Riven, you always want to have positives and negatives. You'll have a maximum of 3 positives and 1 negative. The negative cannot be the same as your positive. So let's say you have bonus damage on the Riven, you cannot have minus damage on the Riven. You'll always be a stat that will counteract something on the weapon, like minus fire rate, minus damage, minus multi-shot, whatever. Another thing is that the Riven stats are determined by your Riven Disposition. For example, here I have 2 different vectors. It's my prime. We look at the Riven Disposition. See, it's these little dots here. Now, of course, this doesn't show you the exact number. It just shows you an estimation because you will have detailed numbers. And then if you have a look at the regular VIDS isn't as popular, and it definitely has a higher disposition. So if you compare the VIDS, here you can see the crit damage is at 1.28. And if you look at the VIDS Prime, that crit damage is at 105. But there's still 3 out of 5 disposition. So it depends on the level of the disposition. So the more popular the weapon, the disposition becomes lower. It's a dumb thing, I know. You just have to get used to it. Here's one thing you have to know about disposition. You have high and low disposition. So for example, this weapon right now, the Piranha Prime, has not the greatest disposition in the world. Low dispositions and Riven attributes. From what I showed you, you saw 3 positives and a negative. However, what happens when you have a lower disposition? That means the positive attributes are going to be significantly lower than running an average mod. So this is when you want to compromise a bit and go with 2 positives and a negative. So for example, on this build, this is a corrosive build. I do have a Riven, and it does enhance my critical damage, but adding on some multi-shot. So as you can see, it has some crit damage and multi-shot. So for a build like this, I could run Sharpened Bullets. Sharpened Bullets here gives me crit damage on kill, and I aim down sights. So this one is pretty close to Sharpened Bullets, but also gives me multi-shot. And Piranha is a pellet-based weapon. You can see right there, I have 29 pellets per shot. So this does shred quite a bit. So that weapon isn't complete unless I use a companion that increases my fire rate, etc, etc. For example, I can also add velocity here on my Warframe to increase the fire rate even more. And then I shoot. I don't have my deadhead stacks, but you can see this thing shoots very fast. There with full deadhead stacks, it's doing way more damage. Very powerful setup right here. Yeah, of course, if you didn't have that Riven, you'll just run a Sharpened Bullets mod. You will lose out on the multi-shot, but you'll still have the critical damage increase. So having a look at this right now, it gives me critical damage, multi-shot, crit chance, and negative puncture. This is an Eidolon hunting Riven.
Why does that even exist?
Of course, this is here to amplify critical hits, and multi-shot not only increases the amount of pellets, but it also helps me increase my combo counter. Snipers are the only guns in the game that increase their final damage based off their combo counter. If you aim down sight, you can see we have several values. We have our headshot damage multiplier, so when we enhance our zoom, that headshot damage does increase. And we have our distance to the target on the left. But right in the middle, when we start shooting something, you'll see shot combo. And our damage increases the more we shoot. So having multi-shot increasing our pellet count will increase how much combo we get per shot. This is why it's important to have multi-shot on an idle hunting Riven. So looking at this build, this gives us our crit chance, crit damage, and multi-shot. We're over 100% crit rate, so we want to add more critical damage, so that's why we have more crit damage. And our multi-shot is at 3.3. That's with split chamber, Vigilante, and this Riven. That's 3 pellets with 1 shot. Now, the reason we're not running galvanized chamber and all that, because when you're Eidolon hunting, you're not stacking up your galvanized chamber as much. You're more focused on the Eidolon shooting its limbs and moving on. So that's why it's better to have a more concrete build without any conditions. Now over here we're dealing heat because, well, it's a build for Shock Trooper because Volt is the best Eidolon hunter, so it's easier to replace an elemental damage mod to give us more utility with our build. Now that you know what a Riven can do for a build, let's see how we can figure out the best Riven for our build. I pulled out the Burstin Prime Incarnon. This is a complete build, and of course, I don't have any Rivens for this weapon, and I've already taken this weapon to level cap Rivenless. Very easy. Now let's break down the build first, because remember, when you're choosing a Riven, never make the build based off your Riven. Finish the build first and work properly, then implement the Riven afterwards. Because you can do everything in the entire game Rivenless. A Riven is not necessary. So looking at this build right now, primary deadhead. This gives us our base damage on precision headshot kill and gives us headshot damage multiplier and reduces our recoil. Because this stacks up 3 times, I don't need to run heavy caliber and serration on the same build. And if I were to put heavy caliber or serration on this build, it will be additive to primary deadhead because these two are the same multiplier. Base damage, even though it just says damage, it's base damage. It will multiply your base damage. So when I put this mod right here, you will see numbers go green. Because this is a conditional arcane, you don't see numbers go green until you actually get a headshot kill. Multi-shot to increase my pellet count, fire rate and punch through, crit rate, crit damage, elemental damage mods, and a flex slot mod. So because we already have a flex slot mod, we already know what we can replace. Bladed rounds. That's a simple thing right here. We can totally replace this. This is an easy thing because the build is already complete without this. Like, I don't need this and we can still kill and do a lot of damage. So I've stacked up a couple of deadhead shots. There you go. That's without bladed rounds. Of course, if we had bladed rounds, it's going to do a bit more damage. So this is a slot that we can replace for a Riven. And because bladed rounds gives us more critical damage, we can get a Riven that gives us more crit damage. Now, why do we need more crit damage? It's because we are critting 100% of the time. And the Incarnate mode, we're getting 50% chance to hit orange crits. And because we have Vigilante mods on the build, this increases our chances of getting an additional critical tier. So that's why when I was shooting, you saw little red crits. It's because of the Vigilante mods. Now here's another thing. Because we have a very high critical hit rate, we want to multiply all the damage that we deal when we crit. So that is why I'm adding on that critical damage. And of course, if I already use a Sentinel with Tenacious Bond, my critical damage goes even higher. So as long as you understand the basic fundamentals of modding, you can choose your Riven. Very easy. And because this build is already complete without bladed rounds, the easiest replacement is, of course, bladed rounds. So let's say I want to use base damage here, and I want to use a different arcane like Primary Blight. That's if I'm using Saren. And if I'm using Saren, I don't need corrosive damage because I have Venom Dose. So for example, if I'm using Saren right now, what I could do is, of course, run Primary Blight as my arcane, keep my base damage here. I can also keep a bladed rounds, but now I removed the corrosive elemental damage, but I can go with, let's say, something like viral. So we put viral right here, and we're using someone like Saren. She already gives me electric elemental damage on my weapon. So if I look at my weapon right now, I have viral radiation because that electricity is going to combine with the innate heat of the weapon. And her first ability has the venom dose augment. So I already have corrosive on the build. And you also may have noticed on this build, I don't have a faction damage mod because she already has roar as the helmet. We already have roar for our faction damage, corrosive element, guaranteed toxin procs, and what do we do? It's a lot more damage. And these guys are weak to viral, and we're reducing their armor with corrosive. You can see how the weapon just became 10 times stronger, like ridiculously strong. Because not only was I using a Warframe weapon synergy, but I changed the build to suit that. That we have this build sorted. How can we enhance this even further with a Riven? Again, this already has a flex slot that we can use. However, what if I drop this and instead went with a 60-60 viral? Let's say I had a depolarity to fit a strong viral mod, but unfortunately I don't right now. So let's say I have this and I'm running something like Galvanized Aptitude. This, of course, is going to be a lot stronger than what I just showed you right now because we're adding in so much more base damage. See, it's even harder. There you go. Right? So, how do we pick a Riven for this build? Now, there are very obvious things to pick up for the people who know. So, for one, we're not using a base damage arcane, but we're utilizing a regular base damage mod. We can get a base damage Riven. Look at our Riven Disposition. That's pretty high. So we can get a base damage Riven here and add on to this. I just removed bladed rounds, so I can get base damage, crit damage, and let's say I want more flexibility, I can even get an elemental damage mod on that. So you can have base damage, crit damage, element, negative. That works. You can have base damage, element, multi-shot. That also works. You can have base damage, fire rates, multi-shot with a negative. Because it's a high Riven Disposition, I can have 3 positives. So I could replace the fire rate mod, get higher multi-shot, get higher fire rates, and get something else like element, crit damage, whatever. As long as I can find a way to enhance my total damage while also providing myself with utility options, that is one way to significantly improve on this already deadly build. For example, over here, let's go to my Korra and her stat stick for Magistar. Now, if we look at this build, it's kind of weird. Of course, it doesn't make sense, right? The stance doesn't matter. We have exposure for corrosive damage. Now, if we look at the build, it has base damage, crit chance when you build up combo. Her Pseudo Exalted builds up combo and, of course, scales with combo-based mods. Critical damage. Of course, you see that number. It's pretty high. Remember, when we're modding with stat stick, you're not modding the weapon. You're modding the ability. So Korra's Whip Claw has a 2 times critical damage multiplier. All the crit damage and the crit chance is going to affect Whip Claw, not this weapon. This is just a vessel to carry the mods and affect the ability. That's why it's a stat stick. If we look at this, we have a bunch of corrosive, and we have toxin here, but we're still getting corrosive. It's because of the Riven. The Riven gives me more base damage. Adding on to that base damage gives me crit damage to multiply the damage when we crit, and an elemental damage mod that adds on to this elemental damage mod to form a combined element. At the same time, I do have a negative. It's minus Grenier. Usually, minus Grenier is horrible, but Korra's Whipclaw is not affected by faction damage multipliers. So this is a free negative, completely boosting my positive attributes. Grouping them up, of course, will help us build up combo. Now you see we're getting red crits, and we're getting into the millions of damage. From 1 to 2 hits, now we're one-shotting everything. Again, steel path modifier. Let's even add Xmas units. We can't group up Xmas units. It's fine. But we can still one-shot them. That's what I'm saying. when you build right and you know what you're looking for, you can always get the perfect god roll for your build. So this is why I'm saying finish the build first and add on to it. So we went through a stat stick and what we can determine for a stat stick. Let's go over like your basic melee build. So this is an old school build here. I say old school, but it's still a functioning build that is pretty much a slash build. Usually if you're using a build like this, you want to prime enemies and have multiple status effects affecting them. That increases the damage multiplier with condition overload. So prime them, build up your combo, and notice you're going to be doing even more damage. Let's say, for example, I don't want to do a slash build. I want to do a corrosive build. Of course, you switch to exposure, yada yada. However, what if I want to do a melee influence build and add on a Riven? So with melee influence, of course, if we look at this arcane, right, we need electricity on our build. Very important. And that's why we need shocking touch. And now to trigger electricity, we definitely need status chance. So again, weeping wounds is a must-have. Of course, if we want damage, condition overload. Now we want a debuff so our electricity can do more damage, and we have to mod for viral. So we got frost and scourge, viral, electricity. This is pretty much a complete build. The rest of the mods here are utility. We need range, okay? We need attack speed, that's for sure. And now we're left with a mod here. And we're left with a mod here. And we're gonna put our faction damage. The build is technically complete. And now you're thinking, but wait, this has no crit. And funny enough, you don't necessarily need to have crit for melee influence builds. It's gonna shred regardless. And another thing with melee influence is that you don't need to prime anything. There you go. With melee influence, you don't need the priming. It's going to spread everything on its own. Because you just swing once, you're spreading electricity, viral, and everything is dying. To enhance this build even further, crits will be amazing. Two mods are taking up viral. If I were to use this on Volt, I can easily replace Shocking Touch. If I was using this on Varuna, I can replace Weeping Wounds. If I was using this on Lavos, I can also replace Shocking Touch. Now we have different ways we can go about this, especially when modding it with Warframe synergies. What if we want to add a Riven? And if we have Roar as our helmet, you can replace a faction damage mod. Critical modifiers can be added. Melee Elementalist could be added for even more damage. So usually when you're finding a build, you want to try your best to replace a lot of things as much as possible. If you're using that mindset, you can figure out what Rivens can go really well. The usual Riven for melee weapons are crit damage, attack speed, and range, because those three are like the best combos. But right now, let's say I'm using Roar. I can replace the faction damage mod. And I'm using a Riven that gives me crit damage and attack speed. So I just replaced Berserker there with crit damage and attack speed. Where would I get the crit chance? Well, that will depend on probably your Warframe. Let's say you're using, let's say with that Roar, you're also using Arcane Avenger. Arcane Avenger gives you a flat crit chance increase. This weapon has a 35% crit chance increase, and Arcane Avenger is a flat increase. You're going to be hitting in the yellows most of the time. So let's say you're using this on someone else. A Riven that can replace an elemental damage mod over here like Scourge. It replaces Toxin but gives you crit damage, attack speed. So there's so many ways that can go about a build to replace something while adding on to the build. It all depends. So this is why I say whenever you're picking a Riven, don't do the build based off the Riven. Finish the build first, see what's working, see what's needed to improve, and then add on to the Riven. Because there's so many things you can do with Warframe weapon synergies, helmet abilities, and your arcanes. This weapon already has a 1 attack speed. I can completely drop Berserker and fully depend on Arcane Strike as my attack speed. If I was using Volt, I have my second ability. So there you go. I freed up 2 mod slots here. I have Roar. I don't need a faction damage mod. Let's say we put Blood Rush and Organ Shatter right here, and we're using Volt. I replaced Shocking Touch. That's a free slot for a Riven. So this build right here, believe it or not, let's go to Volt. Volt has Shock Trooper, has Roar. I replaced Electricity and I replaced the faction damage mod. And because his second ability gives him attack speed, I have replaced the attack speed mod. Roar, Shock Trooper, Speed. So if I were to sing right now, that is the same build I showed you earlier. We're hitting millions. That is the same build right there. All I did was replace a few things, use a different Warframe synergy, and made the build 10 times stronger. So whenever you're picking Riven, I want you to think like this. Break down the builds, break down the synergy, and that's when you can get your God roll. So yeah, folks, this is a Riven God roll guide. And of course, it was a little guide on modding, so hopefully it helped you out. Anyway, that has been it for me. I do hope you enjoyed and learned something from this video. If you did, please feel free to leave a like, share, and subscribe for more Warframe content, streams, and so much more. Do refer to the description. Thanks for watching. As always, a peace. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye.